So as Jake said, I'm an Agile coach at Powershop. I've been there about a year now. Previous to that, I had 5 years experience as Scrum Master, Agile coach and Agile trainer with Boost Agile in Wellington. I work for Powershop. We're an online electricity retailer. So we sell electricity via an online platform. It's a bit of a different model for the electricity industry. And the platform is supported by 62 developers. We have 3 clients. One is the New Zealand retail business, the second one is the Australia retail business, and the third one more recently is for the UK. So there's a power company in the UK called npower who've decided to buy into our platform, and we're repurposing our platform for them to suit the UK market and their regulatory requirements. So that's our biggest project. So we've got 12 teams. We've been growing rapidly over the last year in order to support this UK project. And when I was brought in, it was really to help refine Agile practices so that we could cope with that scaling that we were starting to experience. So when I joined Powershop, the first thing I did was observe what was happening there. And what I found was that there was a lot of centralized control in terms of technical solutions. So instead of teams coming up with solutions themselves, there was sort of a subset of people coming up with technical solutions and doing approvals on them before developers were allowed to work on them. So a lot of the creativity and solutionizing was taken out of the hands of teams and put into the hands of just 3 people. This was causing delays in the system and, of course, was disabling people and resulting in a lot of disengagement. So people loved working at Powershop. They loved the environment, and it had been set up really well as a culture that embraced developers. But what they didn't have was engagement in the work they were doing. So they were also, they were doing Scrum, but what they'd done is they'd sort of had a wee bit of help early on with their Agile practices. And they had gone from following the rules immediately to breaking the rules. So they sort of started and then just leapt to we're going to do it how we want. And what they're doing was missing out on a lot of the benefits that Agile practices provide. So, some of the meetings that I observed early on were just really a chat about what was going on. There were no real outcomes from those meetings. They would have a chat about some of the stories, and then they would all go off back to their desks and wait to have their technical stories approved. So this is what their process looked like. After I'd been there a few weeks, I sat down and I mapped this out. So what they're looking at, they were getting requirements from the business, NZ Retail and Australia Retail at the time. A product owner was writing up the story got approved, and then it went into sprint planning. The team would sit down and have a talk about it in general, and then they would come out of that meeting and they would split those stories into a series of what they called deliverables, which was a series of technical stories for each story. Those deliverables were then approved by a group of only 3 people. And then the team would pick up those deliverables. They would just code 1 deliverable each. And eventually they were going to test. They'd become complete. A tester would sign off, and then the stories were judged complete. But you can see how that might be a bit disjointed in terms of one person's doing one of those deliverables on a story, another person's doing another. There wasn't a lot of continuity there. So what I'd like you guys to do, I've given you some handouts that were on your chairs there, and you might need a pen for this. But I'd like you to form groups of 2 or 3 people with the people you're sitting with, and have a look at that diagram that I've drawn, and have a chat amongst yourselves about where you can see waste and delays in those systems. Obviously, I had some thoughts on it, and I'll go into that in a moment, but I'd like to see what you guys come up with. And once you've done that, I'll ask a few people to present back what they found from their drawing. Okay, I think that's probably enough time for you guys to look at that lovely diagram. Who would like to present a couple of thoughts back about that? Gavin?
The first part of it, there's requirements of PO write stories and story approval. I think that could probably just be one step, which is PO write story, rather than have to go through stages. The requirements could be just written as stories immediately and approved by whoever's writing the story.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Who was doing the approvals?
The PO were approving their own stories. They still are, actually.
So the PO writes a story, then they approve it?
They do, yeah. It's kind of odd, isn't it? The business should really be approving it, but yes.
The part where we talk about requirements being turned into stories by a PO.
Yeah.
And then really, when you go from sprint planning to writing deliverables, assigned to individuals, that then attested.
And then that attested starts to sound very waterfall to me. It looks like mini waterfall.
Yeah.
It's almost a Scrum anti-pattern from my
Yeah.
point of view.
I would say so. Thank you. Is anyone else?
I think almost all of the arrows represent waste. Because at every point you're effectively doing some handover, you lose a lot of context.
Yeah.
And if you've got all of those steps in there, the chances are pretty good that by the end of it, you're going to have something which works but has almost no relationship whatsoever to what the customer needs.
Yeah, that was some of the problems we were experiencing. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay. Yes. We'll just wait for the microphone. It won't come up on the video otherwise, apparently. So.
I agree with that last statement. The arrows represent waste in each context, but what it does look like is that the basics of collaborate and communicate seems very siloed within the process.
Yep.
And even too, we called out the tester sign-off. Well, where's the definition of done context and where's the product owner accepting the story? It's complete.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay.
The product owner has no authority in that process.
Yeah, but absolute responsibility for delivery, which is interesting. It's not something that's reflected in the picture, it's just something I observed. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to move on and talk a bit about what I observed. I think the thing that struck me most about what I was seeing in the process at this point was the splitting stories into these technical stories, the deliverables. Firstly, it was really taking developers away from the intent of the story. Most people were just developing against this deliverable and then handing it off, rather than going back and checking when all the deliverables had been done about whether the intention of the story had been delivered. They were also, usually the deliverables were written by senior technical people within the team only. People would come out of sprint planning and really sit around for a day, even 1 to 2 days, not doing terribly much or doing things from the last sprint, while their senior techs wrote those deliverables and got them approved. Now, we've got 62 developers now, which is a bit more than we had a year ago, but there was still a lot of developers there, and all of those deliverables were being approved by 3 people, which was an incredible bottleneck. It did literally take 1 to 2 days. They were quite often sent back to be rewritten because the solution wasn't seen to be good enough. So you can see that people were really just rewriting them, hoping they'd be palatable and that they would eventually come back to their team and get to be worked on. So what I found was that people, to me, it seemed they were turning up to work, being told what to do, doing it, and then just going home. So, they're a great bunch of people. We all love working together. We all love being at Powershop, but they weren't loving the work. They weren't finding satisfaction in their work. And to me, that wasn't a great way to form a team or to get good work done. So that was the biggest problem I had. So what I suggested to them was more of a Scrum process. I wanted to take them back to just the basics of doing an Agile process so that we could start to do things properly and then start to iterate it. So we go through that process of following the rules, breaking the rules, then making the rules. So we get that middle bit where you get to break the rules as well. So one of the things I had to do was convince some people to change away from the system of the centralised control and approvals. So I sat down with one of the people who was one of the approvers, someone who had a very strong influence at that point at Powershop. And I took him through the whole thing, my picture with the highlighted bits saying I can see some delays here and I can see some delays here. I've talked to some people, done this, I've done that. And what I'd like to do is take one team for 2 sprints, just take them back to a more pure process and see how it works and see what kind of results we get from that. And I sort of, got to the end of my big speech, ta-da, and I said, so what do you think? And he said, absolutely not. That's not going to happen, which really took the wind out of my sails. I didn't know really what to do at that stage. And I was like, okay, wandered off. And I thought, what can I do to get things moving here? How can I get change moving? Because although, I'd been hired, in fact, with this person in my interviews to effect some change and get things moving in a more agile way, no one really wanted to change. They didn't really want to look at what they were doing and really examine it. So the way I started with the change was to seek out another person who was an approver, someone who I knew was a little bit more flexible, sat down with him and I said, look, I've identified one of your teams I'd like to do this thing with for a couple of weeks. This is the model I want to look at and we'll monitor it and blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh, yeah, okay. So we did that, and we started them working directly off stories rather than writing deliverables. We had them approve their own solutions, which was really just going to sprint planning and doing tasking. rather than writing those deliverables. No, it wasn't rocket science. And it worked really well for them, and then other teams started noticing what they were doing. So it sort of caught on as a thing. So obviously I looked at all of the sprint ceremonies, and I started facilitating a lot of them. At the time, I think we had sort of 7 or 8 teams. So I was very busy going to all of the sprint meetings and facilitating those meetings to show them what a meeting looked like that had an agenda and outcomes. So going to sprint planning, doing tasking, making sure that everybody was contributing. We did have a situation also where senior technical people were the only people speaking in meetings. So there was a lot of emphasis placed on this person has a lot of Powershop platform experience. Therefore, the newer people, of which we had quite a lot, didn't really feel free to speak in meetings. I could see that the direct effect of this one day. We were talking about a large GST change, and our senior tech in that meeting was the only person talking. Later that week, I was talking to one of the newer guys, a very quiet guy, who said that he'd done part of his thesis on GST at university. But he never mentioned it because he didn't feel free to talk in that meeting because of this emphasis that we were placing on senior devs being the only person who knew what to do in any situation. So part of my facilitation was to make sure that people were able to speak just by going back to the basics, doing things like silent brainstorming, using a lot of post-its and Sharpies, which, you know, in the beginning everyone was like, what are we using all these tiny little stupid bits of paper? But they seem to be on board with it now and expect it. So, and then other things like, you know, when I first got there, people were bringing laptops to every single meeting, and they were literally sitting, opening the laptops and just doing this. Many of them were on Slack actually, just having a chat. And I'm not surprised because our meetings didn't have outcomes, so why would they be engaged with it? But to me, there was even less chance of engagement if they had that barrier up between them and their colleagues. So not a popular move, but now people expect to come to meetings and either not bring their laptop or just put it away, which helps a lot. So having people work directly off stories now and using tasking during sprint planning and having people really devise their own solutions with their colleagues has created a greater engagement with the work that we do. You know, there's still moments where things come back to us senior technical architects and people say, oh, they've done it wrong, you know, this is a big drama. But, you know, we just have to keep emphasising that this is how people learn. So I've done a lot of coaching around making stories smaller so that people can fail faster and in less risky ways and learn faster. But it's still a challenge. You know, there are still people that have been there a long time who want to do all of the work. But as we're scaling and we're getting bigger all the time, there's no way that we can place all the technical responsibility in the hands of 2 or 3 people. And I think we're beginning to understand that. So some of the other things that we ended up changing was doing a lot of stuff around new team initiation. We do self-selection every 6 months. So there are new teams all the time. Sorry, I'll just move that. So, you know, now we actually sit down as a team and do a team charter and talk about who we are, how we want to work together, you know, how we want to communicate. And things are just set up in a much more collaborative way than they used to be. It used to be sort of a looser collection of people. We're also looking at setting up projects a lot better. It used to be, again, that only a small section of people would be involved in the scoping and estimating of projects, and then that would be handed to a team. Now we're doing story mapping at the start of every project, so that the team are all aligned on what needs to be done to deliver that piece of work, which is working nicely. We're also doing training of people as they arrive. At Powershop, we have a thing called Dev Train, so we often retrain developers in Ruby on Rails. There's a shortage of Ruby on Rails in New Zealand developers. So we often get people from working with different codes, and we bring them in for 3 months and they learn Ruby on Rails. So during that time, we like to grab them as they come in the door and align them on what Agile practices are at Powershop. I find everybody does it slightly differently. So if we can bring them in and get them early and say, this is how we do it. You know, some teams have nuances because there are different teams with different flavours, but the essentials are basically the diagram that I had before it, and these are the reasons why. So one of the things I wanted to do a year ago, because I started as a contractor at Powershop initially for the first 3 months, was to measure the work that I was doing and what impact it was having on the organisation. I didn't want to use velocity or cycle time because, you know, Jeff was alluding earlier to people putting an importance on number of features and churning things out. And I think if we do concentrate on velocity, people do start to think that senior management really wants people to churn out a volume of features. So what I wanted to look at after seeing the talk at Agile Valley by Lisa Adkins and Michael Spade, who I think spoke at this last year as well, on this, was to use the contents of their talk, which was assessing and improving team health, to look at the leading indicators of team health. So you've got that in your handouts there if you want to take a closer look, because I don't know how well you can see that. But essentially, it looks at behaviours in 4 categories. So it's mindset, practices and roles, environment, and relationships and team culture. And then you have on one side healthy behaviours, on the other side unhealthy. So the way that we assessed this was I sat down with team leads and development managers, and we did this together, because obviously it would be no good if I just did it on my own. It would be very subjective. And this is what we did in September when I first started last year, and where we saw things at that time. So, you know, we had a great team culture, but other stuff wasn't working as well. You know, some of our practices and roles, well, quite a lot of our practices and roles sat very firmly in the unhealthy section there. So it gave me a focus on the things that I knew that we had to concentrate on to improve things. So this was 3 months later. Again, I did this in conjunction with team leaders and development managers and some team members. And you can see that things have moved over to the more healthy side. This is when I was putting together this talk, I realised I really need to do this again. It's been quite some time, and who knows, we may have slipped over to unhealthy again, so I do need to assess it. But it was a really useful thing, A, to see what I need to concentrate on, and B, to show that I was offering some value as a contractor at the time. So what I would like you to do with that information, on the 4th handout there, I've got a little scale, and I'd like you to individually think about your own organisation or team and plot where you think you are on this scale, going from beginning your Agile journey to Agile maturity. And then once you've done that, I'd like you to have a discussion with the person next to you about the leading behaviour indicators that show where you are. So you might want to jot down, and either you can look at this thing or the one in your hand, so that behaviours that you think that your team is displaying that lead you to think that you're where you are on the scale. Has everyone had enough time to talk about that, or do you want some more time? Hands up if you want more time. Okay, hopefully you found that useful. So what are we working on now? We do have a bit of a testing bottleneck situation at Powershop. We recently got a really amazing new person who is now head of test practices, who comes from an organisation that's similar to ours in terms of having a monolith of code. And she's working hard with the team to work on things like doing risk assessment on certain areas to find out how much testing they need. We've tended to do all of the testing, and she's helping our team to scale back and do less testing on less risky areas so we can get those things through a bit faster. We're also looking at doing faster releases. Our releases will end up being really inflated. We were doing things like holding up the release because there's an important piece of functionality that needs to go in. But you know, when we were only doing releases a couple of times a week, that was kind of having to happen. But now we're getting more to once every couple of days. I think it would be really great if we're multiple times a day, but I think we're going to have to do some investment in infrastructure and practices in order to get there. But it's definitely something that we're concentrating on. We're also doing further education on Agile practices, for example, Kanban. Lately, a lot of teams have been talking about Kanban, and me and our Scrum Masters have been talking to them about what Kanban means. I think that a lot of people in the teams see it as a way of solving problems that it's not really solving. So one of the problems that some of the teams are experiencing is a lack of a lengthy backlog. So while they're waiting for this testing bottleneck to resolve within their sprint, they're just picking more and more stuff off the back of the backlog, and sometimes there's not enough stuff in there for them to pick up. I said to them, Kanban is not going to help with that. You're not going to magically have a full backlog just by introducing Kanban to your team. And then we've also been talking about WIP limits. Because like anyone, they want to keep working when there's a stop in the system, so they want to bring in more work. So we've been talking about what a team means, you know, that the tester is part of the team, as well as the developers. So that does mean that developers may need to do some testing of each other's work, particularly in the WIP environments, in order to alleviate some of that bottleneck and work as a team to get stories from start to finish rather than from start to testing, which is what had been happening previously. Developers saw it as the end of their responsibility once they handed it to a tester. It'd generally come back and it needs some stuff on it, but they didn't worry about that. They just keep moving on until we would have, many, many things in progress. So we've talked about that a lot. Some teams have moved to Kanban, and we'll be looking closely at how that's working out for them and seeing whether it's actually solved any of the problems they're trying to address when they move to it. As I talked about before, we've been making sure that all our newbies are trained and aligned on Agile practices. Our testers go straight into teams. They don't do a dev train for a few months. They're straight in, working straight away, and same with our mobile developers. So we generally try to catch them on their first week, sit them down and do a bit of this is how we do things at Powershop. This is the basic process. You'll have some nuances in your team, but this is how it works. And then we're there to support them as they start working in sprints. Often if they do go straight into a team and they haven't had that introduction, they're not really sure of their roles and responsibilities within the sprint process, and they sort of sit there looking a bit dazed. We also need to help them quite often with estimation, which can be very difficult when they first start. They've got some cards in their hands with numbers on them, and they're like, not only am I a tester, but also I don't even know what these numbers mean. So we do quite a bit of coaching around that and just ask them to keep up as best they can. We were talking before also about setting up projects in a better way. So as I said previously, we kind of handed the scope of project by the technical architects, which had already been estimated, that had already been communicated to our client, and then we would have to try and deliver it by that deadline. Often that would manifest itself in just 2 week sprints, 2 weeks of work at a time. So, for example, on one of our major pieces of work at the moment, until about 6 months in, the teams working on it didn't really have a view of where they were headed. They knew where they were headed for the next couple of sprints, but they didn't know what they would have to do to go live in, I think it's the 8th of January. So we sat down and we did some story mapping for the rest of that work. Our product owners already had a plan in mind, so we had them come along with the broad themes of work. And although they'd broken those down into stories underneath that, we didn't have them bring those. We had the team sit down, well, not sit down actually, they were standing up around a table and work together to come up with the titles of the stories which would satisfy those themes. Then we were able to map that on a wall into sprints to the end of the year. So, and that way they could then see where they were headed and what they needed to do to get there. And how we were tracking, it sounds simple, I'm sure that everybody else is doing this, but we weren't. So they could see how they were tracking with their stories and sprints. Have we managed to complete these stories in the sprint? If not, why not? And examine those sorts of things. So we're going to work more on that in the new year as well. We've got another major tranche of work coming up, which we'll get ahead of in January to map that out for the year, on the understanding that it'll change, and we'll keep that wall where we put these things at the moment updated. It'll be a living wall which we'll update at the backlog grooming, which is done with 4 teams for that particular project each 2 weeks. So the other thing that I've found recently is that there's a fear of failure at Powershop. When things go wrong, you might say, okay, so what could we have done differently here? What could have mitigated the risk of this thing happening? And the answer I quite often find is, that's just the way it is. That's just what happens. So while we're great at celebrating success, we're very reluctant to look at what we've done and see how we might improve that. We have our retros and we have actions coming out of them, but when there's an actual incident that comes up, we don't sit down and say, okay, this has gone wrong. We've made some mistakes. How can we improve it? So we'll also be working on that in the new year, sitting down with teams and doing things like the 5 whys. And, but enabling them also, it is a bit of a culture change as well, enabling them to acknowledge that there's been a failure and that it's not scary, it's just something that happens in software. And it's something that we need to look at and learn from. And I think part of that, again, is making sure that our stories are small so that the failures are less risky. Quite often we have large stories that when they fail, it has a big impact. So I can see why people wouldn't want to acknowledge that.